as teachers, it's not our place, no matter what kind of teacher you believe yourself to be, it's not our place to be telling people, do this, don't do this. It's only our place to be offering wisdom and offering modifications and allowing them to take them or allowing them to not take them, because if we're teaching with a trauma-informed lens, that's the wisdom of it. That's the way to teach, to allow students to have their own experience, to be in their own bodies, and to provide a safe container for students to figure out what's working day to day and what's not. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. If you haven't been here before, this is my podcast on yoga, birth, and raising kind humans. And today we are going to talk about something that we kind of got into on the last episode, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to be talking about prenatal yoga modifications. So if you haven't already listened to the first episode, the kind of general overview on prenatal yoga modifications, please do listen to that before diving into this one, and I will link that one into the description and show notes. But in this episode, we're going to be getting a little bit deeper into trimester by trimester modifications. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my personal experience with my 2 pregnancies and modifying my yoga practice, and just provide a little bit of insight into what to do trimester, what is safe, what is less safe, and how to best listen to your body. Before we get into this episode, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel or to this podcast, depending on what platform you're listening to it on, and that way you won't miss anything that is coming up in the future. Okay, without further ado, let's dive into this topic. All right, trimester by trimester modifications. So I'm going to be starting with the first trimester and working our way all the way to the 4th trimester, which is postpartum. The first trimester, what you want to think about in that first trimester, actually the podcast that I just recorded a couple of weeks ago that talks about those basic, just general modifications that pregnant bodies would want to know, that if you're teaching an all levels yoga class and if someone showed up and said, hey, I'm pregnant, this is what you should tell them. Actually, a lot of those modifications don't apply so much to the first trimester. Those modifications are really a little bit more specific for 2nd trimester onwards, but it's really helpful to know those general modifications even in the first trimester, just so you can know what to expect. And honestly, in my body, when I was pregnant with both babies, I started on a lot of those modifications right away, because it's just that general energy that you're embracing. You kind of want to know what's next and where your body is going to be going, so that you can prepare to move in that direction, so that it's this kind of dance of synchronicity that you're having with your body and your yoga practice. But within the first trimester, a lot of times you may not be doing a practice that's really much different from an all levels yoga class if that's what you were practicing before your pregnancy. You may be doing something that looks very similar to the average body. Of course, there are going to be differences that you will likely notice in your practice, but if you just compare yourself to an average person in an all levels yoga class, you might not look too different. Now, the big thing that you want to think about or start thinking about is lying flat on your belly. This can still feel okay for a lot of people, but even though there's not a bump necessarily in the first trimester, especially early on, there's just a lot of stuff going on down there. There's a lot that's happening in your uterus, and so placing pressure directly on this space just may not be super comfortable. You know, it's not only the fact that you're growing a baby in this space, that so many changes are taking place, but it's also you might just feel kind of bloated and nauseous, and it just might not feel great to lie flat on the belly. That may not be the case for everyone, so if you still feel good lying on your belly through most of the first trimester, that's okay, but that's something that you just want to know about. And if you are a yoga teacher teaching someone who has shown up to your prenatal or to your non-prenatal class, so to an all levels class, and they tell you that they're pregnant within the first trimester, 13-ish weeks or before, then you can kind of tell them that really it's based on what's going on in their body. That's how they're going to want to modify it. So you may not necessarily even say anything about twisting or breath work or anything, lying on the back, lying on the belly. You may just tell them, be gentle with yourself, because that is the number one thing that you want to do during the first trimester, is just to be gentle and to slow down. So during the first trimester, when I was pregnant the first time, I really think back to that pregnancy a lot because I didn't know what to expect. It was such an unfamiliar time, and I really wasn't sure what was going to be happening in my body. But when I look back to that time and think about how I modified my yoga practice, I really didn't do much in the way of modifying at all during that first trimester. And that was partly because I was teaching so much. I went from teaching like some weeks up to 20 classes a week before getting pregnant to just scaling back just a bit, not going out of my way to sub classes, and just kind of doing maybe more around like 10-ish to 15 classes a week, never up to 20. But because I was teaching so much, I kind of felt pressure to keep up with the practice, to keep sequencing in the way that I had before, to keep doing things in the way that I had before, and not really slowing down so much at the start. And I did slow down a lot in my general like day-to-day life, but within my yoga practice, I didn't really start modifying it much at all in that first trimester during my first pregnancy. And one thing that came up during my first pregnancy is that I was teaching a few heated yoga classes, and I did not know how to approach a conversation with the manager about switching and giving up those classes, because they were classes that I liked, they were classes that I enjoyed, and I felt like I had hustled a lot to that point to get a schedule that I really liked and that worked for me. And so I was so scared to even bring up the fact that I was pregnant, because I knew someone was, a manager or someone else in the class was going to be like, hey, why are you teaching a heated yoga class? That's not allowed. So I didn't tell any of the managers until well into my second trimester that I was pregnant, until the point that my bump was showing. And I just kind of tried to modify the classroom in as much of a way that I could. I turned the heat down to the lowest setting, to 80 degrees, which is still kind of hot, but just didn't demo, just stopped completely demoing at all during that first trimester in those heated classes, so that I wouldn't really break a sweat. And it ended up being fine, but I think that's something that I look back to and think, if I were to do that again, I would have been more upfront with the managers and would have told them that I was pregnant, and would have switched out of those classes, because it's the health of my body, the health of my baby. But I think I was at a point in my life when I was a little bit scared to advocate for myself and scared to speak up for those things that I thought I needed. During my second pregnancy, the experience was completely different, because I was not teaching in person at all. I was living in the woods in California, and I was just working from home, doing some yoga stuff, but also doing global health work, and it was all remote. So I didn't have the experience of feeling like I had to be pressured to have my practice be a certain way, or to teach a certain way, to teach non-pregnant bodies or anything like that. I was just in my own experience, in my own body. And so I started modifying my yoga practice way, way, way sooner with that second pregnancy, in ways that felt more intuitive. I don't even fully remember. I remember much more about my yoga practice from my first pregnancy than my second, because with my second pregnancy, I think I was just so in the flow of my body and I knew what to expect. And so early on, very early on, I kind of stopped lying on my belly, I was lying on my back a little bit during the first trimester, but started taking a wider stance, started doing those things that I knew I needed to do to strengthen and prepare my body for birth. and for postpartum and all of those things. I just started doing them way earlier because I was trained as a prenatal yoga teacher at that point, and I just knew what to expect. So all of that is to say that in the first trimester, you may not have to do much at all. You may not have to, if you're a teacher, tell your students to do much at all, because it's going to be their experience and they're going to be in touch with the wisdom of their body, or it's going to take some time to start to really listen to what their body needs. But as a teacher, it's never our territory to really be telling people you can or can't do things. That's the more kind of like pre-2010s yoga mentality of, I am the teacher, you need to listen to me, this is what's safe for you, this is what's not safe for you. That's a more hierarchical way of teaching, and it's just not a way of teaching that I adhere to. But really, as teachers, it's not our place, no matter what kind of teacher you believe yourself to be, it's not our place to be telling people, do this, don't do this. It's only our place to be offering wisdom and offering modifications and allowing them to take them or allowing them to not take them, because if we're teaching with a trauma-informed lens, that's the wisdom of it. That's the way to teach, to allow students to have their own experience, to be in their own bodies, and to provide a safe container for students to figure out what's working day to day and what's not. So in the first trimester, you might advise students to slow down, to be gentle, to maybe be a little bit cautious when lying on the belly, or maybe not even cautious, that may not even be the word, but be a little bit curious if they decide to do traditional vinyasas where they're going down to their belly or lying on their belly. Be a little bit curious to notice what feels good day to day and what doesn't, and allow them to modify their practice as needed. So in the second trimester, that's really the time where all of those modifications that I mentioned in that last episode start to apply. So lying on the belly starts to become not only uncomfortable, but less of a safe thing to do. Spending time applying pressure to the belly, it's not comfortable. It's not necessarily the safest thing to do for your body. Lying on the back at some point during the second trimester also becomes uncomfortable. As I explained in the last episode, it places pressure on the blood vessels in the back of the body in a way that is less safe, but you can certainly be there for an extended amount of time if it feels comfortable. So if Shavasana on your back still feels comfortable into the second trimester, and if legs up the wall and those kind of things still feel comfortable, then that's generally safe and okay to do. But once you get to the point of starting to feel dizzy or lightheaded when lying on the back, that's when you want to start to modify those shapes. So all of those things I said in the last episode, lying on the belly, lying on the back, deep twists, forceful abdominal breath work, forceful abdominal core work that works the superficial muscles of the abdomen, all of those things you want to start to modify in the second trimester. As I said, not only for comfort's sake, but a little bit more for safety's sake. So this is the time where your role as a teacher, if you see someone who is pregnant in your class, I would say, for me, I'm never going to go up to a person and say, hey, do this, don't do this, if I see someone who I think is pregnant, unless they come to me, because I never want to assume anyone is pregnant. I had an experience really early on when I think it was before I became certified in teaching prenatal yoga. It was before my first ever prenatal yoga workshop that kind of blew my mind and changed everything in terms of my teaching. But it was early on in my teaching when I had someone come to my class who was pregnant. And I had the manager tell me before I started teaching, you have someone who is pregnant coming to your class. They just called in and they told me. And so the person who walked through the door, I assumed it was that person. And I said, hey, so you can do this, and this to modify your practice. And only later I found out that she was actually pregnant, but she was very early on. So early on that I shouldn't have even been able to see that she was pregnant. She was like 7 weeks on. And so I made an assumption, but somehow I kind of knew. I kind of had this feeling that she was pregnant, but still made an assumption that she was the person who had called in and asked specifically for modifications and things like that. That person actually never came to class. So I ended up having this long dialogue with someone who I assumed to be pregnant, and it ended up being completely fine. It ended up being, she was very thankful for all of the modifications and things like that. But I think that taught me to never assume that someone is pregnant, even if I think they appear to be, because they could not be pregnant. How was I supposed to know that she was 7 weeks? I mean, most people, you can't tell when they're 7 weeks pregnant. And a lot of people at 7 weeks pregnant don't want people to know anyways. And a lot of people, even when they're in that early phase where the bump is starting to show, still may not have made that announcement publicly. And so it's never your place as a teacher to step in and kind of announce to the whole room this pregnancy when maybe they haven't announced it to anyone yet. So my opinion as a teacher is that I would never go up to someone and tell them how to modify their practice in the second trimester unless they come to me. And then when they come to me in an all levels class, then I'm going to offer them maybe not all of those things that I said in that podcast episode, but if they come to me and they're over 13 weeks pregnant, I'm going to give them a few suggestions that apply to the class that I'm teaching. So if I know we're going to be going onto our belly for a restorative pose or for a yin pose, then I'm going to tell them, I'm going to come over to you at that point and give you an alternative. And give them something that has the same energetic feel and that maybe targets the same muscles, opens the same parts of the body as those other people in the class, but is a little bit safer and more sustainable for them. But then I'm going to give them the option to do that or not. So if they still want to do the same pose that everyone else is doing, even if it's something like lying flat on the back, and they decide to do it and I say, hey, that might not be comfortable for you, but listen to your body. It's not my place as a teacher to say that's not safe, unless it is truly something that is really harming themselves or others in the room. But something like lying on their back during an all levels class, that's not going to pose a significant risk to themselves or others. So I'm never going to step in and say, stop what you're doing right now, in a way that is a little bit more forceful, in a way that is kind of how yoga teachers taught 10, 20 plus years ago. But the other thing that I do as a teacher, from my perspective, if someone comes to my class and they are pregnant, I typically offer a prenatal friendly class to the entire class and don't force anyone to go onto their belly. Say, if you want to go down to the belly and do a vinyasa, you can. If you want to stay in cats and cows, you can do that as well. And then sometimes I'll switch up the entire class sequence because I notice someone is pregnant in the class. I may not go over to them specifically and tell them the modifications if they haven't told me that they're pregnant, but if they're visibly very pregnant, I may just change up the entire sequence, just to make it something that is safe and accessible for the entire room. And that's something that I've learned can feel good in a lot of bodies, because the crazy thing about prenatal yoga is that it's not only for pregnant bodies. It is a soft, more gentle approach that can feel good to the general population, especially those with low back pain or discomfort. And that's a lot of people. A lot of people today, adults, experience chronic low back pain. And so offering a prenatal yoga sequence is actually a way to sneak in some things that stabilize that low back region and stretch the areas that need to be stretched while making it safe for all people in the room. Now, my experience with the second trimester is that I got, both times during my first and second pregnancy, I definitely got that big burst of energy and glow and felt my hair was beautiful and skin and nails and all of that just felt beautiful. And I had so much energy during the second trimester for both of my pregnancies. That is not the case for everybody. So as a yoga teacher, I'm never going to assume if someone is in the second trimester that they're feeling great, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people already start to experience a lot of the things from the structural changes, the things from bearing more weight, the pubic symphysis disorder or low back issues, SI joint issues, all of those kind of things, sciatica, all of those kind of things, the discomfort that comes often in the third trimester, some people can experience in the second trimester, or the nausea of the first trimester for a lot of people never goes away. So I'm never going to assume that if you're in your second trimester, you're feeling great. But in my experience during both pregnancies, it was a time of a lot of energy where in my first pregnancy especially, I didn't go to any classes at all during my first trimester. I just taught. But in my second trimester, I finally went to a workshop in New York City, and I was modifying things because I was visibly pregnant, obviously, and I kind of knew the modifications, but I felt so great to be surrounded by this sweaty room of all this energy and movement and life and things like that. And I felt like it was not only something that was accessible to me, but that was just medicine to me, to be out and to be moving. And so if you're pregnant in your second trimester, don't feel afraid to join kind of an all levels yoga experience or workshop or things like that. Especially if you are with a seasoned teacher, they're going to be able to offer you modifications even if it is going to be a group experience. But that's something for me that when I think back to that second trimester of my first pregnancy, I always think back to that weekend in New York that I almost didn't go to because I was afraid. Because I was afraid of the bus ride from Boston to New York, and because I was afraid of showing up pregnant and being too much of a burden to the teacher to have to give out these modifications and things like that. But I know if I were going to be pregnant again and had the opportunity to go to New York for a yoga workshop, I would take it in a heartbeat. So that comes kind of with time. I've noticed that with the first pregnancy, a lot of people can be so caught up in all of the rules, all of the things you should do, all of the things that you shouldn't do, all of the things that you could do to, quote, harm or endanger your baby. And while it is so important to be loving to your body and to nourish your body and kind of familiarize yourself with those rules, even with those things that I mentioned in the other podcast episode, all of the general, quote, rules about modifications for prenatal yoga, what I've learned with my subsequent pregnancy, with that second pregnancy, is that there's wiggle room in a lot of those rules. And that those general rules, sure, they can be things that most people can follow and will have a healthy pregnancy, maybe, or maybe not. There's always that possibility that something can happen, and it's always something unknown, and it's usually not caused by something that we are doing in our lives. It's just genetics or bad luck or whatever it may be. And being able to understand what is in your control and what is not in your control is so helpful in allowing us to be less of a perfectionist with the rules and just to really embrace pregnancy as a time that is empowering rather than a time that feels really scary. So third trimester modifications are going to be all the same that I mentioned for the second trimester, all of those same things that I mentioned in that earlier podcast about the general prenatal yoga modifications. So no lying on the back when it starts to become uncomfortable, no lying on the belly, no deep twists, no deep belly breaths or core work or things like that. Just taking a little bit of a wider stance. All of those things are going to apply in the third trimester. Those things, as I said, will start to apply during the second trimester, and then the third trimester, there's no avoiding them because the belly is so big that you're going to have to make room. You're going to have to lessen your forward folds and do gentler back bends and do all of those things to support your body in a way that feels intuitive. These things that I'm saying are all things that may seem like a lot to keep track of, but when you are in it, in this big pregnant body, you will do these things intuitively. So don't feel like these things have to be memorized. But the one difference between second trimester and third trimester is that in the third trimester, everything is bigger, the belly is bigger, and everything can start to get more achy, uncomfortable. And for that reason, we can start to slow down a little bit. Because we are carrying more and more weight every single day, we get to be a little bit bigger, the bump gets to be a little bit bigger. We just want to do more to protect our joints, especially ankles, knees, hips, pelvis, the entire pelvis, all of this area. You really want to think more about stability in the yoga practice over going into really deep, juicy stretches. The hormone relaxin, I think I mentioned it during the last pregnancy, or during the last podcast, but the hormone relaxin surges so the body becomes more loose, more pliable, more able to get deeper into stretches, but that's not necessarily a good thing. That can make it more easier also to overstretch, to strain muscles, to damage the joints, things like that. So we want to be practicing with a lot more compassion for the body and a lot more gentleness. During the third trimester also, it's a time where a lot of people start to feel restless, especially towards the end. It gets to be harder to breathe deeper into the body, and because of the weight and the trouble breathing and the heartburn and all of those things that a lot of people experience, it gets really difficult to sleep towards the end. So a lot of pregnant bodies are operating on a little bit less sleep. And I think that's a big thing that contributes to the quote pregnancy brain that people supposedly have, being a little more out of it, forgetful. It's just hard to function at the highest cognitive level when you're not sleeping well at night, and that really happens a lot in the third trimester for a lot of people. So tailoring the yoga practice for this time, you just want to be slower, gentler, do more restorative yoga poses in positions that feel comfortable, positions that feel sustainable, positions that can allow you to soften, can allow you to deepen. And if you are a yoga teacher and you have someone in the third trimester come into your practice, that's when you want to tell them to really slow down, to do things a little bit slower, to be more intentional. And most people who are going to go to an all levels yoga practice during their third trimester, they generally know how to modify their practice at that point. Most people are not going to be coming into someone's yoga class at 40 weeks if they have never taken yoga before. It's usually people who are really more experienced, more seasoned, and know how to modify their practice in a safe way. So as a yoga teacher, really trusting in the intuition of other people and knowing that they have wisdom within and will know how to modify their practice. But our role as teachers is just to be there to help and support and offer guidance as needed. For me, during my third trimester in my first pregnancy, I keep going back to my first pregnancy again because I don't think I attended a single yoga class in person during my second pregnancy because of the time in California at the farm, because of the move and the travel and all of those things. I wasn't teaching in person or going to classes. I just had my yoga practice, which I knew how to modify and which really served me a lot, but that was my own private space and that no one was telling me what to do or anything like that. But during my first pregnancy, again, I was still teaching full time. And during the third trimester, that's when lockdown happened. It was during the pandemic, and it was like March 2020 when I was in that first pregnancy and the third trimester started. That's when everything went indoors and online, and I had to teach all levels vinyasa classes online, which is just so much harder when you're starting to just figure out how to teach. And when you're not really sure who's there on the other end of the camera and you can't see the students and there are all these tech issues happening and you're just trying to teach your regular jam, but there are all these new variables that are thrown at you, and then you have this big pregnant body as well that's starting to slow down and that's starting to become less able to get into those shapes that you're supposed to be demoing in all levels classes. And the kind of norm for teaching online at that time, what studios wanted was that we were supposed to demo everything 100%. And that was just getting really, really hard for me, and I would find myself getting out of breath a little bit with those classes. And I look back on it with a lot of fondness, a lot of, I think, naivety, which was kind of the theme for my entire first pregnancy. But you can't know until you know. And my first pregnancy was really just a time of figuring it out and finding out what worked for my body and what didn't. I think if it would be now, I wouldn't be teaching online like however many classes I taught back then. It wasn't even that it was that much, it was just the whole process of figuring out how to teach online that kind of seemed like it consumed my entire third trimester, all of that lockdown. Pros and cons, right? Because that gave me something to live for, that gave me something to hope for, that gave me something to really occupy my time in a time that felt kind of big and overwhelming and scary for a lot of people. But I was just so in it, trying so hard to offer something to myself and to the community in a time where it was a little bit stressful and a little bit isolating and all of that, but I still felt so engaged because I was offering all of those classes, or trying to at least. So it was a big time of learning for me, but I think the biggest thing that I learned from both my first and my second pregnancies is that really towards the end, it just feels good to slow down. I think I stopped teaching all of those online classes maybe a couple of weeks before my due date. I think maybe like 37 or so weeks is when I stopped teaching online. And it was 3 weeks that was kind of magical, that I kind of felt like I was in this very liminal space, in this space between being one person to two, literally. And it gave me a lot of time to slow down and reflect and to draw goddesses and to try to bake things and just explore myself and live my yoga off the mat and just have this really safe container of my space for those last few weeks of the pregnancy. So I look back to it with a lot of fondness. Even though it was a big scary time, like I wasn't sure where I was going to be giving birth because the birth center shut down and because I was very close to contemplating doing a radical home birth, which didn't end up happening, but I look back to it with a lot of fondness, I really do. And I think that's because I really slowed down and was able to listen to my body and was able to practice yoga in a way that really served me. I did a lot of hypnobirthing meditations and yoga nidra and all of those things, and did a yoga nidra training online during, I think, like 37 weeks pregnant, which was just exactly what I needed to be in a restorative shape and just meditating, preparing myself mentally for the birth. So that is something that really, really served me towards the end. The fourth trimester, I just want to get into this briefly because I feel I can't really do a prenatal yoga modification episode without getting into that fourth trimester. I know I did last time, but it just feels like there's something missing if I don't talk about what's to come after the birth. Because those modifications are completely different. And the thing is, during pregnancy, we're in this process of getting ready to open our bodies. The belly is expanding. We're doing all of this pelvic floor awareness, thinking about opening the pelvic floor and all of those things for the birth. But postpartum is the exact opposite. It's about closing in the belly. It's about closing in the joints, closing in the hips, doing all of these things, or having all of this energy that moves in that opposite direction of stability and support, and going back to being one single human with a separate body that we're nourishing still. So the biggest thing postpartum, you can go straight into lying on your belly after giving birth. It sometimes feels a little weird, a little odd to suddenly lie on your belly after all of those months of not doing so. I know it felt really odd for me, especially after my first pregnancy. But the biggest thing is you really want to slow down in a way that is different from the slowing down at the end of pregnancy. There's still at the end of pregnancy that little bit of fire, that little bit of wanting to rev up and move to get the baby out. But during postpartum, it's actually less safe to do a kind of all levels yoga practice than it may be for people in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. All bodies are going to be different, so all experiences are going to be different. But postpartum, what's going on in those first 6 weeks is there is a giant wound in the womb the size of a dinner plate. So there is a scab that is trying to form from where the placenta was, and it's literally like the size of a dinner plate. So when you go out and do things and move around and are active and are on your feet and are allowing gravity to flow down, that is more likely to reopen that wound than just being soft, lying on the belly, or not lying on the belly, but lying down, doing restorative shapes, being in this sleepy, slow postpartum state where you're just with the baby and kind of in a blur, which I think both of my postpartum experiences were just kind of this sleepy, soft blur. But the one thing that I did during both postpartum experiences was I relied so much on movement for my mental health, I think, that it was really hard for me to wait 6 weeks to exercise again. I was definitely doing yoga probably before I should have been doing yoga, and it was mostly things that were slow and gentle and safe. But at the same time, I think once I started feeling more comfortable, I probably got into the core work and things and like inversions and more active practices, sun salutations, vinyasa, all of those things earlier than I should have. And the one thing that I really did that I would not recommend to anyone is going for runs in the 4th trimester. I waited till the end of that 4th trimester for both of my pregnancies, but then I know that with running, it definitely reopened those placental wounds. I definitely experienced more of that lochia, that bleeding after going for runs, because running is high impact. And with both of those postpartum experiences, I just was so itching to get out of the house and to move my body that I just kind of went for it, and thankfully didn't experience anything more than a little bit of extra bleeding. But that bleeding went on longer than I think it should have for both of my postpartum experiences. I did not experience prolapse, which is just the organs kind of moving down lower than they should, the uterus descending down below the pelvic floor kind of situation, which I didn't experience. But doing high impact activities is really, it's going to be risking the body going into prolapse, which is just more difficult to heal. So if I were to do it all again, I would have waited at least 3 months after giving birth to get back into that high impact activity. And it's really hard for me. It's really hard for me to just sit in the house and not go out for walks and just be still. That is kind of the biggest thing that I have been battling my whole life, is that I want to move, I want to do things, and it's really hard for me just to rest. And both postpartum experiences were really a teacher in how much I rely on movement for my own mental health. So I know it's hard, but the safest thing for if you are teaching a postpartum body in a yoga class is just to tell them to slow down. Just give them kind, gentle reminders. And they may not want to hear it. A lot of people don't want to hear it, but it's kind of, just a good reminder that we can be soft, we can be slow, we can be in this space of self-care and nourishing ourselves and just not hurrying the process, not rushing the healing, which is so much easier said than done. But the overall kind of modification for the 4th trimester is to slow down, but also to be gentle with the core area, especially if there's diastasis recti that's healing, that separation of the abdominal muscles. You don't want to do any of that superficial core work still. You want to mostly be doing diaphragmatic breathing until you build up the strength in the core body. And just to listen to your body. Like all trimesters, that's the one overall message, is really just to listen and to be patient and to allow everything to fall into place. So that's really it. That's kind of my long-winded explanation of the 3 trimesters and the modifications that you can offer as a yoga teacher if you have students in any of those trimesters coming to your yoga practice, but also for pregnant bodies who are just curious about what to do to modify the practice or what's to come. That's kind of an overview. If you have questions about any of this, please do let me know. I'm just talking from my experience, which is just 2 pregnancies that were different, but it's only from my body, and I know my body is different from other bodies. So if you have questions or if there are things that I missed, let me know. If there's something that you want to talk about in a future episode, if you want to dive deeper into the breath work for birth or the meditation for birth or for postpartum, honestly, because postpartum is hard too and we don't talk enough about that, please let me know. Please let me know your ideas, and I want to hear from you. Let me know how your prenatal and postnatal yoga experience has been, how you've modified your practice, what's worked for you, what's not so much worked for you. Let me know. Before I see you next time, please don't forget to like this video. Please subscribe if you have not already. Rate me 5 stars on Spotify if you listen there, or any other kind of wherever you listen to your podcast. Please do subscribe, rate me 5 stars, all of those things. And please do subscribe on Patreon as well. On Patreon, I will link that below in the description or show notes. And your support helps me to continue with this creative process and to continue to allow me to share with the community all of these things that I want to share. So let me know what you want to hear next, and support, show love, and I will see you next time.